Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. I'd like to share with you a game of mine that I played a long time ago when I was rated somewhere around 1600. I figured that when I want to share thoughts to players who are relatively new to the game, it is easier to do that through games that aren't played by grandmasters, but players who are much closer to their level. So let me get started with the game I plan to share with you. I had the white pieces and I played the most common starting move, e2 to e4. As we already discussed in many of the other lessons, the idea is very simple: to control the center and to open up the diagonal of white's bishop on f1 to be able to come out and develop. My opponent proceeded by trying to do just exactly the same by playing e5, and I played knight g1 to f3. This is not only a developing move, but right away attacks black's pawn on e5. The most common way to respond to this is to develop black's knight from b8 to c6 to protect that pawn on e5 that has just been attacked. However, my opponent instead played a less popular move, although it's also an opening line. It's called the Philidor's defense, named after the famous chess player and French composer of music. Here white has several decent moves. One is to develop the bishop to c4 or to develop the knight to c3. However, the most frequent move is what I played also, to play d4, to immediately fight for the center. This move not only opens the diagonal of white's dark squared bishop, but also puts pressure again a second time on black's pawn on e5. After every move of your opponent's, you should ask yourself the question, what does my opponent want to do? And if you would be playing with the black pieces in this position, the answer to that should be, my opponent would like to capture the pawn on e5, because the pawn on d4 as well as the knight on f3 are targeting that pawn, while I am, or black, is only protecting it with one pawn from d6. Black has numerous ways to react to that. In fact, typically, to any kind of attack, just like in real life, there are three ways to respond. One is to pick a fight and, in fact, capture the piece that is attacking us. Another way would be to run away, which in this case is not an option. And the third, to bring help. To bring help means to bring another piece that protects the pawn a second time. In some more rare occasions, another option may be to make a so-called intermediate move. That is, for example, your opponent attacks your pawn or bishop, and you ignore that and, let's say, give a check or attack an even stronger piece than the one that's being attacked, like a rook or a queen. So specifically in this position, one of black's options is to capture white's pawn on d4. And the other options include to protect the pawn on e5 by one of the other black pieces. Now, black has a good number of ways to do that, some better than others. Typically, if you can combine your general plan or attack with responding to your opponent's threat, that's a good thing, because that means you're combining two things at once, that is, you're saving time. To accomplish that, to continue developing with your minor pieces, that is a bishop or a knight, black can protect the pawn on e5 by either moving the knight to d7 or to c6. and those are two of the best moves in this position. To protect the pawn with another pawn by playing f6 is not a good idea for multiple reasons. On one hand, black would weaken light squares around the king side, and in fact, black would have real difficulty to castle after the bishop would move to c4, at least to castle to the king side. Also, it would take away the f6 square from black's knight, and that would be the natural and best ideal square for black's knight of g8. To protect the pawn with a queen typically is not the greatest idea, especially not at such an early stage of the game. A move like queen e7 that we see on the board right now indeed does protect the pawn on e5, however, it steps in the bishop's way on f8. It does not look very good. Also, after the white knight would develop to c3, it could potentially threaten to move into the center, to move into d5, which in turn would right away attack again the black queen. That's one of the main reasons why generally it's not advised to move out early with your queen, because it will be exposed to attacks, and that would result in wasting time, because as the queen being your most important piece, you will be forced to move away from the attack. After d4, my opponent responded by protecting the pawn with knight c6. It was a bit better and a lot more popular to rather move the knight to d7 and protect the pawn in that way. The game continued with knight c6, and in this position, the most popular and perhaps most accurate move would be to pin the knight, develop the bishop to b5 and pin the knight. That would threaten right away with a number of things. It would threaten to trade the bishop for the knight, with that removing the guard, the second guard of the pawn on e5, and then after the exchange of the bishop for the knight, the pawn could capture the black pawn on e5. Instead of that move, I played for a different plan, which also gives white a little bit of an advantage, but is a bit inferior to the above-mentioned pinning move with the bishop. I continued by trading on e5, and my opponent captured back with his knight. I traded knights, and he captured my knight. Generally speaking, there is no reason to exchange pieces of the same value unless you have some kind of gain out of it, or you're avoiding some kind of loss. Well, in this case, and this is a very typical example, what I have been trying to do is to strip black from the right to castle. And I'm accomplishing this by the exchange of the queens. And as we can see now, the black king has lost the right to castle for the entire game. Once a king moves, it can no longer castle, even if it moves back eventually later on to its starting position to e8. I continued by developing my knight to c3. In the opening stage of the game, the beginning part of the game, that is approximately the first 8 to 10 or sometimes 12 moves, generally try to follow the basic opening principles, that is to develop your knights and bishops, preferably in a way that they control one of the 4 key center squares, d4, d5, e4, or e5. My opponent responded by developing the knight to f6. As we shall see, this has its drawbacks. More advisable was to rather first develop the bishop to e6, So in some cases, the black king could escape from future checks along the d file to c8. The game continued with knight f6. And just like on the other side, I had the option to create a pin. Again, there is an option to do that on the king side by moving my bishop out, and that's what I did in this position. Pinning the knight. Pinning the knight means that the knight is stuck to where it is because it cannot move as long as the black king is on d8. Remember, a king can never ever be exposed and remain under attack. An additional idea of this move is, other than pinning the knight, to potentially trade my bishop for the knight and force the black pawn to recapture, and that would mean that black will end up having two pawns on the same file, two pawns on the f file, as well as isolating the pawn on h7. And that would give a superior pawn structure for white. Having pawns on separate files near each other, like white has here on the king side, is certainly giving an advantage over pawns that are one on top of another that is doubled, or on isolated files by themselves. We shall see that in just a couple of more moves. Here my opponent was better off again developing his queenside bishop first, so his king could run away, hide away. After a check would arrive by castling to the queenside, the king could run and hide on the queenside. Let's go back to the game where my opponent played actually a very natural move by bishop to e7. This is a move that unpins the knight of f6. What that means is that now the black knight potentially could move, because then if the white bishop would capture the black bishop on e7, black would simply recapture with his king. I responded by castling to the queenside. This is again one of those multi-purpose moves. On one hand, white castled, put the king out of the middle and into safety, and at the same time immediately attacked the black king with a check. So this is one of those examples of a multi-purpose move. If right now the black king would move out of the check, that would give white the opportunity to start an immediate attack and play knight b5. That would be a rather strong move, threatening to capture the black pawn on c7, and running away with the pawn would certainly be no help, because the knight would still get to c7 through not winning the pawn, however winning even more by forking the black king and rook at the same time. On the other hand, if black decides to protect the pawn with the bishop, then white would have the opportunity to capture the knight. Now again the black bishop from d8 is tied down to protecting the pawn on c7. Therefore black's best choice is to capture back with the pawn, but that will exactly result ruining the pawn structure on the king's side, what I have been talking about a few minutes ago. Let's go back and see the situation after I castled, when my opponent moved the bishop to d7 to block the check. I certainly welcomed this news that the bishop moved into a pin. A pin again means that that bishop right now cannot move anywhere as long as the black king is on d8. Here perhaps it was more accurate than what I played to first immediately move my bishop out to c4, attacking the pawn on f7, as black has difficulty in protecting that pawn, other than playing rook f8. which is a little bit passive, and in that case bishop c4 is certainly a good idea. If you're forcing your opponent into a defense, a strong piece such as a rook, protecting a pawn, typically it's a good idea. It's a measurement of success. Let's go back again and see how I continued. I traded my bishop for a knight on f6. This is one of those things that unless it brings a material gain or some other kind of gain, you would not trade a bishop for a knight. So for example, if my opponent would be forced to capture back with a pawn and ruin their pawn structure, then it certainly would be justified. However, in this case, my opponent also had the option to capture back simply with his bishop without ruining his pawn structure. Perhaps he was afraid that I would use the pin by playing bishop b5. However, there was no reason to fear that, as black would be able to respond by blocking the threat to the bishop by playing c6, and black would be just fine. Luckily for me, my opponent chose the inferior move and indeed recaptured with the pawn. And here I continued with a natural developing move, bishop c4, again a move that not only just develops, but at the same time right away keeps the opponent busy because black needs to react to the attack to the pawn on f7. There is a little trick here too. If black would play the natural-looking king e8, which would accomplish two goals at once, that is to protect the pawn on f7 and move out of the pin, that is to free up the bishop on d7. The problem is that the king is overworked. The king is protecting the bishop and the pawn at the same time. And white cannot take advantage of that by playing bishop takes pawn, check, and when king takes bishop, then rook takes bishop, and white just won a pawn. My opponent did not fall for the trick, but protected the pawn with the rook, which was the only move not to lose it. And here there are several good-looking moves. In addition to what I played, perhaps a bit even better was to play rook d3, which on one hand prepares the doubling of the rooks on the d file, and at the same time eyes towards potentially going to attack the black pawns through the third rank. I continued by playing knight d5, centralizing my knight and also perhaps trying to relocate it to an even better place, depending how my opponent continues. Here a better choice for black would have been to play c6 and chase my knight away. My opponent's response was rook g8, going after my pawn on g2, and I continued with knight e3. On one hand, protecting the pawn on g2, and on another hand, reopening the diagonal of my bishop to attack the pawn. Again, it renews the threat that after king e8, the sacrifice with bishop f7 again would win a pawn. My opponent responded with a mistake, a very typical mistake. Since I did not move right now my bishop to attack the pawn on f7, but I moved a different piece, namely my knight on e3. I moved it from d5 back to e3 and created a sneaky discovered attack. It's very often being ignored by inexperienced players that they only look at the piece that just moved. What does that piece attack? And forget about a situation like this when, although the bishop, the other piece didn't move, but yet the attack got created to the pawn on f7. Black here should have protected that pawn by playing rook g7. Instead, my opponent responded with king c8, trying to run out of the pin and forgetting about the pawn which I gladly captured. Rook moved to g7. Logically, black is trying to stay on the half-open file, but black is pressuring my pawn on g2. Now, of course, the bishop is under attack on f7, and I retreated the bishop to c4. And here my opponent made a big mistake, which made my life a whole lot easier to convert my advantage to a win. Of course, black would like to get into the game the rook from the corner. The problem is the black king right now is in its way. Black has certainly some difficulty in accomplishing that goal. In fact, that's what black was trying to do with the move he played. Just to give you an example, if black would like to open up space for the king, for example, on b7, the problem would be that the bishop check would come immediately from a6, forcing the black king back to the pin on d8. My opponent played the big mistake by playing bishop to c6. The big problem with this move is that it leaves control of the f5 square. It's very important to notice every single move that which squares or pieces has been attacked by the last move. Like this move, for example, attacks the pawn on e4. However, also at the same time, you need to be aware of which squares no longer are controlled by the piece that has just moved. In this case, I should have right away moved my knight to f5, which is a devastating fork from black's perspective. Now the knight attacks the rook. The rook cannot hang around on the 7th rank to f7 because my bishop is guarding that square, and if the rook moves to any other square, then the bishop on e7 will be lost. I played a slightly inferior move by first giving a check, although it also results in winning major material. Black has the same problem. Rook needs to move, and then knight takes bishop. On a higher level, this position would be resignable. However, if you're still a beginner, novice player, and if you're listening to this lesson, chances are that you are, I certainly suggest not to resign in a position like that. First of all, your opponent may make a mistake. Second of all, it's a good lesson to learn, even if your opponent knows how to win, to learn about the technique on how to convert material advantage to a win. Let me show you how the game ended. Right now, black is under a serious and major threat by rook d8. Checkmate. So black needed to open a little window for the king. And here, if I would play today, I would most likely just play f3, making sure I don't lose any of my pawns. I instead, in the game, played bishop d5, following the principle that when you're ahead, exchange pieces. The drawback here is that by doing this exchange, I ended up losing a pawn. So the idea is to exchange pieces, but without any loss of material. Here I would play today rook d2 f1, not only to offer additional exchange of pieces, but then trying to win the black pawn on f6. I played knight e7, came king a7. Finally, the black rook in the corner is coming into the game. I played rook d7, attacking the pawn, king b6, and now knight d5 check. Black's position is falling apart real quick. There falls a pawn, king d6, and now I played a very tricky move, c4. The black king is surrounded by a lot of pieces, some his own, some enemy pieces, and checkmate is very, very close. Black was careless, played rook g8, and now checkmate in 2 follows. I suggest you try to pause for a moment, figure out how to end the game real quick on your own? And the answer is push the pawn, and after king e6, checkmate arrives with rook e7. Well, I hope you learned some ideas from this instructive game, and be back next week for some more chess knowledge. Thank you for listening, and so long until next time.